After the emotional storm with Daniel settled, Claire realized that the real challenge lay at home, in the quiet, unnoticed spaces of her marriage where years of distance and routine had built walls she had long ignored, and she knew that confronting these truths would be harder than any fleeting thrill she had felt, yet also far more necessary. That morning, she sat across from Mark at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of coffee, her heart racing with a mixture of fear, relief, and determination, and began to speak in a voice that was steady but soft, telling him about the emptiness she had felt, the loneliness that had crept into their life, and the long years when she had silently suppressed her own needs to maintain peace and routine. Mark, startled and initially defensive, listened as Claire carefully explained that her feelings for Daniel were not the problem. He had been respectful, kind, and never crossed a line, but that the spark she experienced was a mirror reflecting what had been missing between them for years: attention, emotional connection, and genuine appreciation. She spoke of her longing for meaningful conversations, shared laughter, and moments where she felt truly seen, and how the realization of these needs had been both painful and enlightening, forcing her to confront the truth about her own happiness without casting blame or shame. Mark's initial shock gradually softened into understanding as he recognized the weight of her words, the honesty in her eyes, and the courage it took to speak so openly, and for the first time in years, they began a conversation not about schedules, bills, or routines, but about feelings, vulnerabilities, and the gaps in their marriage that had gone unaddressed. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Mark both took deliberate steps to rebuild communication, to listen without judgment, and to reconnect in ways that had been neglected for decades, attending therapy together, sharing small moments of affection, and learning to appreciate the emotional presence each could bring, no longer taking silence or routine for granted. Daniel, aware of his role in this awakening, stepped away quietly, visiting less frequently and eventually withdrawing altogether, leaving Claire to navigate the new awareness he had sparked in her with integrity and respect. And though she felt a pang of longing at his absence, she also felt empowered, knowing that the thrill had served a purpose. It had forced her to see her own heart clearly and act on truths she could no longer deny. Claire began to reclaim small joys in her life, revisiting hobbies she had abandoned, connecting with friends she had drifted from, and taking time to appreciate herself beyond the roles of wife and mother, realizing that personal fulfillment was not selfish but essential for emotional health and for sustaining meaningful relationships. She noticed changes in her own demeanor, more confidence, more presence, more warmth, and saw subtle but genuine shifts in Mark as he responded to her honesty, creating an environment where both could explore feelings safely, without judgment, and with renewed commitment to understanding each other. Claire also reflected deeply on the nature of attraction, realizing that the thrill Daniel had given her was not a betrayal but a wake-up call, a reminder that emotional connection is vital, that long-term relationships require attention, and that feelings of excitement can illuminate unmet needs rather than act as destructive forces if handled responsibly. With this clarity, she became mindful of her choices, learning to differentiate between fleeting emotions and long-term commitments, and understanding that maintaining respect, honesty, and boundaries was not just a moral responsibility but a path to genuine happiness for herself and those she loved. As she moved through her days, Claire integrated the lessons of that intense period into her routine, allowing herself to feel again without guilt, to seek joy actively, and to communicate openly, creating a home environment where love could be expressed in words, actions, and attention, and where the silence that had once defined their life was replaced by understanding and shared intention. Over time, the sting of longing for Daniel softened, replaced by gratitude for the awakening he had caused and the emotional growth it inspired, and Claire embraced the idea that life's unexpected sparks can serve as mirrors, reflecting the changes needed within oneself rather than acting as temptations to act recklessly. She noticed small victories, laughter returned naturally, conversations lasted longer, meals became shared experiences rather than mechanical routines, and quiet evenings were filled with genuine presence instead of unspoken distance, all signaling that the foundation of their marriage could be rebuilt on honesty and mutual effort. Claire's journey of self-discovery and renewed connection taught her the importance of listening to her own heart, setting boundaries, and acknowledging feelings without letting them dictate harmful choices, and she began to see life as a balance of emotional awareness and responsible action, a combination that allowed her to grow without compromising values or relationships. In the end, she understood that the thrill, the longing, and the emotional upheaval had served as catalysts for a deeper transformation, prompting her to reclaim her voice, her desires, and her sense of self, and to engage with her marriage and her family in ways that were conscious, compassionate, and fully present. Standing by the window one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky with warm colors, Claire felt a sense of calm and strength she hadn't known in years, realizing that she could carry the memory of the spark Daniel had given her not as a secret burden, but as a lesson, that emotional awakening can happen unexpectedly, that growth requires honesty, and that true fulfillment comes from embracing life, love, and oneself with courage, respect, and mindful choice, ensuring that the story of her heart continued forward with clarity, dignity, and hope. The days after that evening moved quickly on the surface but slowly inside Emma, and by the time Daniel returned the following week to drop off a jacket Mark had left in his car, her emotions were already unsettled, shifting in quiet ways she did not fully understand, and when she opened the door to see him standing there with an easy smile, she felt a small, unwanted flutter in her chest that she quickly pushed away, reminding herself that this was just Mark's friend, nothing more. Mark was still at work, his schedule unchanged, and Emma invited Daniel in without much thought, the house bright with afternoon light, ordinary and calm, and yet the air between them felt charged with something new, something built not on words but on memory. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, the conversation starting lightly, moving quickly through safe topics, work, traffic, weather, but even those simple exchanges carried a warmth Emma hadn't felt in a long time, because Daniel paid attention in a way that felt rare, responding to her words instead of waiting for his turn to speak, and she found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the moment. As the minutes passed, the talk shifted naturally, not forced, not dramatic, and Daniel mentioned the dinner again, saying he hoped he hadn't made her uncomfortable by staying, his tone careful, respectful, and Emma was surprised by how strongly she felt the need to reassure him, telling him honestly that his help had meant more than he knew. She spoke faster then, as if afraid she might lose her courage, explaining that most days felt quiet in ways that went beyond sound, that she stayed busy but often felt unseen, and as she spoke she watched Daniel's expression, expecting confusion or distance, but instead she saw understanding settle there, calm and steady. He told her he had noticed how much she did without asking for recognition, how she held things together smoothly while others moved through her space without noticing the effort behind it, and the words struck her deeply because they were true, because no one had said them out loud before. Emma felt a sudden rush of emotion and looked down at her cup, embarrassed by how close she felt to tears, and Daniel, sensing the moment, didn't press her, letting the silence breathe instead of filling it, and that choice made her trust him more than she wanted to admit. The pace of the afternoon quickened as they talked, the conversation flowing easily now, stories exchanged, small laughs shared, the tension easing into something softer, something dangerously comfortable, and Emma became aware of how natural it felt to sit there with him, how little effort it took to be herself, not careful, not guarded. At the same time, a quiet warning echoed in her mind, reminding her of boundaries, of promises, of the life she had built, and she tried to steer the conversation back toward neutral ground, asking about his work, his plans, his life outside her home, and Daniel answered openly, describing a life that was full yet still missing something he couldn't name. There was a moment when their eyes met and held a second too long, not intense, not obvious, but enough for Emma to feel her heart beat faster, and she looked away quickly, standing up to refill the coffee as if movement could calm her thoughts. Daniel watched her with an expression that suggested he noticed the shift, and when she sat back down, he spoke carefully, saying that he respected Mark, that he would never want to create confusion or pain, and the seriousness in his voice made Emma's chest tighten because it confirmed what she had been trying not to think, that something real was forming in the space between them, not acted on, not named, but present all the same. She nodded, agreeing quickly, saying that nothing was wrong, that she valued honesty, that she appreciated his kindness, and even as she spoke she felt the weight of the moment settle deeper, because it was easier to pretend nothing was happening than to face the truth behind her words. The afternoon light shifted as time passed, shadows stretching across the floor, and Emma realized how long they had been sitting there, how easily hours had slipped by, and the realization made her uneasy, because it showed her how hungry she had been for connection, how ready she was to accept it wherever it appeared. Daniel stood then, sensing it was time to go, and Emma felt a familiar mix of relief and disappointment, both sharp and confusing, and they walked toward the door together with careful steps, the air thick with things unsaid. Before leaving, Daniel turned to her and said quietly that she deserved to feel valued, that he hoped she knew that, and the words stayed with her long after he left, echoing through the house as she closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, breathing slowly, trying to steady herself. Alone again, Emma moved through the house at a faster pace, cleaning what didn't need cleaning, rearranging what didn't need moving, anything to keep her hands busy while her thoughts raced, because she understood now that this wasn't about Daniel alone, it was about a part of herself she had ignored for too long, a need for presence, for attention, for emotional closeness that had quietly grown unmet. When Mark finally came home that night, tired and distracted, Emma greeted him as she always did, smiling, asking about his day, listening as he spoke in half sentences before checking his phone, and she felt the contrast sharply, not with anger but with sadness, because she now saw the distance clearly instead of accepting it as normal. As she lay awake later, staring at the ceiling while Mark slept beside her, Emma replayed the afternoon in her mind, not the words exactly but the feeling, the sense of being heard and understood, and she knew that something had shifted inside her that could not simply be pushed away, that the quiet comfort she had felt with Daniel had revealed a truth she could no longer ignore, and as sleep finally came, it carried with it the heavy knowledge that she was standing at the edge of a choice she had not yet named, one that would demand honesty, courage, and a willingness to face what her heart had been quietly asking for all along. Days after Daniel's visit, Emma couldn't stop thinking about him, though she tried to push the thoughts aside while folding laundry, driving to the grocery store, or even sitting quietly in the living room with Mark, whose attention was always elsewhere, buried in work or screens, and the contrast between the two men made her heart ache in ways she didn't fully understand, leaving her restless and unusually aware of the space around her, noticing how quiet the house felt and how much she longed for simple, undivided attention. One afternoon, Daniel stopped by again, this time to return a book Mark had borrowed, and Emma opened the door, her heart skipping despite her best efforts to act casual. She invited him in, trying to appear ordinary, though the air between them seemed charged with a tension that neither acknowledged aloud. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, sun streaming through the windows, the conversation starting lightly about books and mundane things, yet it moved quickly into more personal territory as Emma found herself sharing feelings she had bottled up for months, talking about the loneliness, the effort she put into the house, and the quiet sadness of being unseen even when surrounded by people she loved. Daniel listened, his attention unwavering, nodding and responding with care, not judgment, not advice, simply listening in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and safe, a combination she hadn't experienced in years, and it was startling to realize how much comfort a single person's presence could bring. The words came easily once she started, spilling out her frustrations about Mark's distance, her longing for emotional connection, her exhaustion from carrying responsibilities alone, and each sentence seemed to lift a weight from her chest, though it also made her heart pound with the forbidden thrill of confiding in someone other than her husband. Daniel didn't react with surprise or disapproval, he remained steady, calm, compassionate, which made Emma trust him more than she expected, feeling a mix of relief and fear that her honesty was creating a closeness that should not exist. They talked about life, work, feelings, and small dreams, the conversation flowing naturally, and for the first time in a long while, Emma felt understood not as a wife, not as a hostess, but as a person with needs and desires, and the realization was both exhilarating and terrifying because it reminded her of how much she had been denying herself in her marriage. At one point, their eyes met, holding a glance that lingered just a moment too long, not overt, not romantic in a physical sense, but enough to make Emma's pulse quicken and force her to look away, catching herself in a mix of shame and longing she didn't want to name aloud. Daniel stood up slowly afterward, sensing the moment was delicate, and he said quietly, with a sincerity that caught her off guard, that he respected her and her marriage, that he would never want to be the cause of confusion or pain, and the weight of those words pressed on Emma's chest, making her realize that what she felt was real but complicated, a truth that could not be ignored. She nodded, saying carefully that she understood, appreciating his honesty, and yet internally, she knew the connection between them had shifted something inside her, awakening a part of her heart that had been quiet too long, a longing for attention, care, and acknowledgement that she could not simply dismiss. The afternoon light changed as shadows stretched across the kitchen floor, time moving unnoticed, and Emma realized how easy it had been to share so much, how natural it felt to have someone truly listen without judgment, how comforting it was to feel seen and understood, a stark contrast to the distance she experienced daily with Mark. As Daniel prepared to leave, the air felt thick with unspoken feelings, a quiet tension neither acknowledged aloud, and when he finally stepped outside, Emma felt the strange ache of disappointment mixed with gratitude, aware that her emotions were more complicated than they should be, that the simple act of his presence had stirred things she hadn't faced in years. She closed the door slowly, leaning against it as the quiet house pressed in around her, reflecting on the day, realizing that nothing inappropriate had happened, yet her heart had shifted in ways she could not ignore, understanding that emotional intimacy could be as powerful and confusing as anything physical, and that her longing for connection was something she needed to confront honestly. Alone again, Emma moved through the house, straightening cushions, arranging cups, cleaning again though it wasn't necessary, her hands busy while her mind raced with thoughts of Daniel, the clarity of her own feelings, and the ache of unmet needs she had carried silently, and for the first time, she recognized that the emptiness she felt in her marriage was real, not imagined, and that she had to decide what to do with this awareness before it grew into regret. Night fell, and when Mark came home, tired and distracted, Emma greeted him with warmth but felt the contrast sharply between the disconnection of her marriage and the vivid awareness Daniel had stirred, the difference pressing on her with gentle insistence, reminding her that honesty, attention, and emotional closeness were essential, not optional, and that she could no longer ignore the truth of her own heart. As she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling while Mark slept, Emma replayed the afternoon over and over, not the exact words, but the sensation of being heard, of being valued, and the realization settled deeply that something significant had shifted inside her, a truth she had long avoided, and that the next steps she would take, the choices she would make, had to honor her feelings, her need for connection, and the recognition that her heart could not remain quiet any longer. That night, Emma waited for Mark to come home, her mind spinning with the weight of what she had realized over the past days, the quiet ache of unmet emotional needs pressing on her more strongly than ever, and when his car finally pulled into the driveway, she felt a mixture of relief, apprehension, and urgency because she knew it was time to speak, to stop holding back, to let the truth of her feelings surface before it became something heavier, something she could no longer control. Mark entered the house, tired and distracted, dropping his briefcase by the door, his attention flicking to emails and phone notifications even as he greeted her with a tired smile, unaware of the storm that had been building silently for weeks inside the quiet of their home, and Emma, summoning courage she hadn't felt in a long time, asked him to sit down with her, her voice calm but steady, carrying a seriousness that immediately caught his attention. The conversation began carefully, Emma choosing her words with precision, not as an accusation, not as anger, but as a clear and honest statement of her heart. She spoke of the loneliness she had been feeling, of the ways she had carried responsibilities alone, of the longing for connection that had quietly grown between them, and for the first time, she didn't mask the depth of her emotions, trusting that speaking openly was more important than comfort or politeness. Mark listened, initially surprised, then attentive, his usual distracted demeanor softening as he absorbed her words, realizing for the first time how his distance had affected her, that providing materially and being physically present wasn't enough, that she had craved his emotional presence, his attention, his understanding, and that his neglect, however unintentional, had left her feeling unseen and undervalued. Emma didn't mention Daniel, because the point wasn't about another person, it was about her marriage, about the gap that had grown silently over the years, and as she spoke, she felt a sense of liberation, like the words themselves were a balm to her weary heart, allowing her to express what she had carried in solitude for far too long. Mark, absorbing the honesty, began to respond, his voice low and sincere, admitting that he hadn't realized the depth of her feelings, that he thought his efforts were sufficient, that he had underestimated the importance of emotional connection, and the admission hit Emma with a mix of relief and sadness, because while it was painful to hear the truth of their disconnection, it also opened the door for change, for acknowledgement, for repair. They talked long into the evening, not in a rushed or pressured way, but with the urgency of two people finally facing realities they could no longer ignore, discussing what needed to change, how they could be more present for one another, how they could rebuild the closeness that had faded under the weight of routine, and in each exchange, Emma felt the tension inside her soften, the clarity of speaking her truth mingling with the tentative hope that Mark was willing to meet her halfway. The conversation didn't solve everything in one night, some wounds were too deep for instant repair, but it created a foundation, a starting point for trust and understanding to grow again, and as they sat together afterward, the quiet of the house now filled with mutual awareness instead of absence, Emma realized the power of honesty, the strength it took to voice needs that had been silent for too long, and the courage required to confront not just another person but the patterns that allowed distance to thrive. Outside, the evening deepened into night, stars appearing faintly in the sky, and Emma felt a sense of calm settle over her, tempered by the knowledge that change required commitment from both of them, that action had to follow words, that their love could not survive on habit alone but needed awareness, care, and dedication, and she understood that she had done what was necessary by speaking, by choosing transparency, by trusting that her heart deserved recognition. Daniel, meanwhile, gradually stepped back from her life, his presence becoming a quiet memory rather than a daily reminder, and while she never forgot the gentle understanding he had offered, she recognized that his role was never about creating tension or conflict, but about reminding her of her own worth, the importance of being seen, the value of emotional honesty, and the awakening of feelings that had been dormant within her. In the days and weeks that followed, Emma and Mark began to navigate their renewed connection with effort and care, small gestures growing into larger patterns, conversations becoming more honest and frequent, the subtle attention and presence she had longed for slowly becoming a reality, and Emma felt a renewed sense of belonging in her own home, a fragile but growing trust that the love they shared could evolve into something deeper, something attentive, something aware. She reflected often on the quiet afternoons with Daniel, not with guilt, but with appreciation for the mirror he had unintentionally held up to her heart, showing her the importance of acknowledgement, presence, and honesty, and she realized that while the feelings he stirred were complex and temporary, they had a purpose, leading her to confront truths she might otherwise have ignored, prompting growth within herself and within her marriage. One night, after an especially long day, Emma watched Mark settle beside her on the couch, their hands brushing naturally, conversation flowing easily, and she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years, the knowledge that the distance could be bridged if both were willing to see and respond to each other's needs, and that love was not merely about time spent together but about emotional presence, attentiveness, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. The lesson of the days past lingered in her mind. Sometimes, what happens isn't what you expect, not dramatic or dangerous, but subtle, quiet, and powerful, shaping hearts, awakening awareness, and creating opportunities for growth and intimacy in ways that ordinary life rarely allows. And as Emma drifted off to sleep that night, she felt both gratitude and clarity, understanding that emotional honesty, self-awareness, and courage were the keys to sustaining connection, to fostering love that could weather the quiet distances of life, and that she had finally chosen to honor her own heart without fear, marking a turning point that promised renewal, hope, and a deeper, more authentic bond with the person she loved most.